Well, one question that comes up all the time, because I work in fiction and poetry, is people ask a question about, does that make my stories more, and then they always use the word poetic. When I first heard the question many, many years ago, it was one of the few questions that really made me think about my answers. And the answer that I've come up with at this point really evolved over a lot of years, and it started out with that term poetic, which I was always uncomfortable with, because a lot of times what people are calling poetic in prose strikes me as purple prose or overwriting, and it's the kind of term where you kind of want to say, well, I know what you mean, but can we come up with a better word? And so the first thing I did in answering the question was to try to junk that word, which meant I needed one in place of it. And I kind of decided that what they were really asking me was about the lyrical. And as soon as I had that word to work with, rather than poetic, which when you come down to it doesn't really mean anything, then suddenly something that I don't think I'd have ever thought about, at least thought about articulating, started to register with me. And that was that if you could work in the lyrical, why did that stand out? Well, it stood out because different genres, each one has its own signature. For lack of a better word, let's call it signature mode. So even though poetry, going back to the epic, through Keats, maybe less so now, but even now in poets like, say, Phil Levine, it has always been a wonderful storytelling medium. We don't really think of the signature mode of poetry as being narrative. We think of it as being lyrical. The other one that comes up the most is, because so much of my work is set in Chicago, that everybody wants to know, and I think this is a very common question anyway, how autobiographical is your writing? But when you've got that one little neighborhood that keeps popping up in stories, I think it emphasizes that natural question that readers have. I make my own quiet place by, in early and mid-draft, listening to music. And as long as I've got it, you know, when I'm working in a studio in the little office that I rent to work in, or if I'm working in an apartment that I've got set up to work, then I'm probably listening to a stereo. But if I'm on an airplane, I've got the ubiquitous earplugs, and so one thing it serves is to shut out outside stimulus. I mean, it also serves to open your sensors, and the music itself starts to participate in the writing. Well, music is the main one, but I certainly believe in the recharging of the batteries, or you know, to put it another way, that the imagination needs to be fed, which is why you read, but it doesn't just require reading. It, you know, movies, theater. The other one for me is I think of writing kind of as having the intensity of working that working underwater does. So that if somebody is you know, on the payroll for one of these shallow rigs out in the Gulf that employ divers, a full diver's day is 4 hours, not 8. And because writing has that kind of exhausting intensity about it, and yet you're just sitting at a desk, my personal feeling is that you need some physical representation of it later in the day. Well, yeah, my next book, I think, is about those desires. One of the things that I've done is I have used place as a organizing principle. And so it looks it may look like to a reader who goes to a library shelf that all this guy writes about is Chicago. And, you know, for these many, many years now, I've got work set in all kinds of other places, including imaginary places, that just haven't fit in the books that I've brought out. So one thing I want to do is bring out different books in different settings, or books in which setting is not, a sense of place is not such a primary organizing principle or identifying principle in the word. But then there's all kinds of other things, genres I haven't worked in. So right now I'm working on a nonfiction novel, trying to keep a foot in each camp. When I talked about those modes earlier, I think the counterpoint that most engaged me when I was younger was the counterpoint between the lyrical and the narrative. But in trying to keep yourself fresh and stretch yourself out, one of the things that I've had wonderfully available to me because of Chicago has been theater. Next to New York, it's the best theater town in the United States. And it's a town of many, many experimental little theaters. And some of my favorite theaters like Steppenwolf and The Looking Glass and Victory Garden, all of which have won major awards. And if somebody asked me to go back and define the lyrical mode, or to define the narrative mode, or to define the expository mode, I wouldn't have much problem doing it. If somebody asked me to define the dramatic mode, that one for me is the most difficult to define. And so as I've begun going to a lot of plays, I've begun, kind of really trying to study drama, not as if to write drama, although that would be great, but to see if I could start to understand what I loved so much about theater, and if it could be moved more into fiction. So one of the things that I've been working with a lot more in the last several years, and that I'm hoping is very prevalent in these books that I'm close to having finished, it is dialogue and scenic construction that's been more influenced by theater. Well, it's such a word that could be defined in so many different ways. My basic take is that it should be left open in its definition, because I would regard somebody who was a great journal keeper as a writer. I would regard somebody who had a very keen critical mind and could write lucid prose that captured their readerness, that waltz that a reader does with a text, Edmund Wilson being a great example of this. That person for me would be a writer as well, but a writer for me would also be somebody who I would think of as primarily a maker. That is, the act of making we're calling writing, but it's an act of making the way painting is an act of making, the way sculpture is an act of making, the way dance is an act of making. Of all those different definitions, each one which I think is allowable, and there's probably plenty of others that I haven't even mentioned, the one I feel closest to is making something apart from yourself. So that the way a painting isn't the painter, the story finally, or the poem finally, is not the writer. And it's that ability to create an object out of this incredibly abstract medium that's used for so many things other than making. Legal documents, laundry lists, conversation. And I think that's what makes the question, who's a writer, interesting, because we don't use poetry, music and painting and sculpture and all those other art forms are not as utilitarian as the use of language. And so one thing that I would divorce from my definition would be a stenographer in court is not a writer. Somebody writing a laundry list is not a writer. I think that's a very confusing thing, actually, to a lot of people when they're trying to learn the art form. That because we use writing in so many ways other than as an art, in a way we don't use music or painting, or that somebody coming to it doesn't realize that there's at least as much craft to learn about this abstraction, that they would take for granted, that they had to learn how to use a camera in the days people still use cameras, or that they would have to learn to play an instrument, or figure out how to mix paints and do all those other things. And that because language is used for so many other, in so many other ways other than to make an object, it's not as immediately evident that there's this craft that you learn.